Two, and one. Panel, for the benefit of the debate, right at the outset from the government will give you certain key definitions and characterizations. Now, when we talk about relationships here, we'll be sticking to the ambit of romantic relationships. And when we talk about pleasure, pleasure in our paradigm is mainly equivalent to emotional and introspection, interpersonal happiness and contentment. Now, another thing to be noted categorically here, panel, is that in our paradigm, the person in question, the measurement in question would be of the net sum of pleasure. Now, what the net sum of pleasure would entail would be the amount of pleasure that will be known by the individual would be the total pleasure that they will experience, the contentment that they'll experience throughout the course of the relationship, subtracting the net trauma that they'll experience. So now they'll get to know a clearer picture of what will happen in our paradigm. Now, before going on to talk about the tangible benefits of this paradigm, I'll talk about the status quo and how do relationships look like in today's world. Now, relationships, one thing that is very important to be noted about relationships is that more often than not, the happiness or a certain percentage of happiness that is experienced by individuals or partners in a relationship is contingent on the compatibility with the partner, with the other individual. Now, because of fact, because of the contingency on the other individual, the other partner, it is out of the individual's, it is out of a person's power to determine their extent of happiness. They can control it to a certain extent. However, the other person does play a role which cannot be denied. Now, this is more so because of the inability to determine how the other individual might act in the future. Now, the balance of probability is that almost everyone who enters into a relationship will have at least one or two unhappy or traumatic relationships due to this very fact, due to this unknown factor or this leap of faith that is taken by individuals. Now, another major characterization that we provide to you is pertaining to the impact that a relationship has on an individual's personality. Now, this impact different, multifaceted in nature. When we talk about this impact, one facet of this impact could also be negative or traumatic in nature, wherein it could potentially lead to crippling the person with respect to future relationships, their outlook, the sort of mannerism in which they understand or trust the individual is all contingent on previous relationships and the trauma that an individual or the sort of experiences the individual undergone. Say, for instance, if a person, if a girl or if a boy has been gaslighted or has been in a negative relationship wherein their self-worth has been demeaned, now when they go on to get into a relationship with someone else in the future, that a tinge of whatever trauma that they have experienced would still persist in their head, which is something that is inherent harmful for personal growth, which I'll explain, and even my DPM will explain. Now, panel, what needs to be understood that and firmly understood is that the past experiences of an individual's life are what affect and shape that individual's future. Now, we also acknowledge that a few toxic relationships or a few unhappy relationships won't have that big of a substantial impact at a much later point of time. However, the sort of trauma or the sort of mindset with which the person will grow for at least a temporary period of time would be harmful for that individual's growth. And that is why we contend that it is better to have or to enter into a relationship which has a higher net pleasure percentage as opposed to another. Now, talking about the benefits of this paradigm, panel, the most important thing that I'll talk about is pertaining to consent. Now, when I talk about consent, there are certain things that need to be understood. First of all, is pertaining to knowledge. Now, when I talk about knowledge, what I mean is that every relationship is based on a degree of mutual trust. how does trust come about? Trust comes about between two individuals when they have at least an iota of understanding of what the other person is like, or they have certain beliefs that this person will act in a particular manner, and that is why that knowledge is very much required for there to be mutual trust. This is not just applicable for romantic relationships. You can see this in business relationships, contractual relationships, friendships, but the need for this trust is amplified in romantic relationships because of the propensity of people acting in a manner so as to hide their proclivities or abstain from divulging the truth so as to impress the other individual. Since this propensity is higher, that also leads to increase in the chances of people lying about what their true selves are like. Now, what this leads to, if I am lying to my significant other about who I truly am, then my significant other is not making an informed choice. Based on half knowledge or no knowledge, they're providing their consent to be in a relationship with me, which is something that is problematic for both the parties involved, but more so for the person who is giving, whose consent is being vitiated on a principal level, because the propensity or the chances of me changing in the future are something that cannot be mitigated. Now, what does our paradigm suggest? Give you instead, our paradigm gives you true consent. How does true consent come about, and what are the benefits? Now, the benefits of true consent panel are that the person has a higher feeling of accountability. Now, I as an individual cannot shift the blame to the other, to my significant other, and claim that it is because of them that the relationship turned out traumatic. I will have to introspect, I will have to think about what I have done, and I will have to take a certain degree of accountability, which is something that is essential and one of the most common ways for ensuring self growth. Another major benefit that emerges out of our paradigm panel is that avoiding of a certain percentage of net trauma is in itself something that will benefit the individual in a manner so as to ensure self growth, so as to ensure a higher degree of contentment. And because of all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
All right, we thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Let's have the next speaker lead off. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear. Let us know how you
Okay,
prepare your POIs. You can start whenever you're ready.
Yep, let me just kind of set up my papers. Okay, and I will probably not be looking at my Zoom screen, so it would be nice if my opponents could verbalize their POIs, if that's possible. Okay. Okay. And now I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In a world where society is already divided by racial, financial, and social standings, we believe that this motion will only exacerbate this division and create a polarized society in which people with similar interests will exclusively interact with each other. We are very proud to oppose today. Now, before I move on to talk about my substantive points, I'd like to first give a refutation to the previous speaker. So the essence of what the previous speaker said was that consent is needed and people need knowledge for mutual trust. However, we say that they have not given us like an explanation as to why this kind of knowledge is exclusively needed for this kind of mutual trust, right? We think that rather spending time together and being together is what creates more of this trust, mutual trust and consent. Moreover, they also talked about how with this motion, they will take more accountability of their actions or whatever, right? However, we believe that if in a relationship or like after a breakup, if you cannot shift like the responsibility to others, you blame yourself, right? We say that creates more that makes it it creates a situation where you become the one in fault for that relationship, when that should not be true, right? We say that creates these people to be unnecessarily like depressed mentally, and we say that is a very dangerous situation. So we're against that, and I will be incorporating my other refutations into my substantive. So today I want to make one thing clear, that racism and classicism is going to be reinforced with this motion. First, I'll be talking about how this will harm minorities, and second, I'll be giving a counterfactual and directly attacking the government's paradigm. So first, about harming minority, we say in the status quo, like financial capacity is predetermined as what we consider pleasure, right? Because we live in a capitalistic society, more money means you're able to get more things you want. It leads to pleasure, right? As a result, if we carry on with this motion, the poor will end up with the poor, the rich will end up with the rich, and white people will end up with white people, etc. Right? Because the incentive becomes pleasure, the rich won't have like an incentive and a reason to interact with the poor, right? Because this will definitely happen, because they will only interact with people that match with their metric of pleasure. You feel comfortable with the idea of being with someone that's similar to you, that lives in a similar situation to you, etc. Right? However, we believe that in reality, relationships are not like that, right? Sometimes opposites attract, and this motion actively destroys the chances of this happening. How does this happen? One, it reinforces elitism, right? Because the people in higher classes have no incentive to interact with people with the lower classes, and therefore it exacerbates social division. And second, because of the social division, like an exclusionary society will like further be encouraged, right? This means that these minorities and poor people will be actively shut out from these elite societies. These poor won't have like the social capitals and accessibility to education and whatnot. We say that not only on an individual level, but on a societal level, we'll be harming minorities. So second, about the counterfactual, we say that in our paradigm, interracial marriages will increase on our side, right? Because if you're unable to measure pleasure, that's contingent on like that person's social and financial status. They'll be more willing to date people for who they are as a person, not about like other materialistic values. Two, they will love their partner for who they are. Three, they can overcome any hardship with that partner. And four, there's more diversity and diverse forms of relationships that way. So why are these? So why is it so important that we don't measure this kind of pleasure? Because we say that a critical part of being in a relationship and having that experience is hardship, right? The opening government talked about how we should like cut that part out of their lives because that affects their future. But rather we say that this kind of hardship and experience and bad experiences, perhaps traumatic experiences, is good for that person's independence and growth as a person, right? This is because first of all, they'll be able to sympathize with diverse backgrounds, right? Like with now that they don't have like now that there's nothing getting in between two people from different classes getting into a relationship, they're able to like interact and sympathize with diverse backgrounds, and this deepens relationships between people, not only on an individual level but on a societal level. And second, these individuals become more independent, right? Because the problem with only focusing on pleasure is that people become like lazy and they lose the ability to be independent because they depend so much on the pleasure they like receive in that relationship. Why is this important? This is important because part of being in a relationship means overcoming hardships and like your first big fight and getting over harsh breakups. We see like and only seeing pleasure just destroys this because they will only be seeking pleasure from just their partner, and the relationship will be a place where they're able to like escape reality and things like that. So why is this bad? We see two scenarios. One, they are stuck in a very toxic relationship, right? These two people become inseparable and they're unable to like stay away from each other, and therefore they isolate that couple isolates themselves from other people and communities around them. They become alone and they become entirely dependent on that one person. Second, when they break up, they won't in the instance where they break up, they won't be able to live alone, right? Because they're mentally weak, because they rely on like other things that are not themselves in order to like seek pleasure. So we say that as a result, they're going to rely on things like drugs and alcohol because they rely on rely on others to create pleasure for them. So therefore, because this motion creates exclusive societies and communities, destroys the meaning of relationships, and creates toxic relationships, we are very proud to oppose, sorry.
All right, thank you, Leader of Up. Let's have the next speaker, Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
I'm just quickly gonna arrange my sheets and then I'll begin. Also, I'll be taking my POIs through the chat. All right, I'm gonna begin my speech in three, two, one. Panel, first of all, a big bro moment for me when I heard the LO speech, right? This is exactly the benefit that we were gonna claim. The fact that there are gonna be exclusive interactions within social groups. Understand that I'll firstly deal with this now only, right? Understand that if I am a rich guy and I don't know any sort of metric through which I'm gonna know how my relationships are gonna go, I will be more likely or more inclined to look into within my own social groups, because people always feel safer while having relationships within their own social groups, since they feel that there will be higher compatibility. People need a bigger push, a bigger incentive to actually go and have relationships outside their social circles, outside a outside an identity that they do not actually feel related to, or don't actually know that well, since human beings always have that sort of apprehension about the unknown. And at that point, we tell you that it's much more likely on our side of the house that people will actually have relationships with the communities, with social circles that they are not a part of. Understand that if I am a rich person and I see that there is, for example, someone who does not belong to my class, but that person is someone who I'm going to have a happy, meaningful relationship with, I am a lot more likely at that point to actually go into a relationship with them. On the other hand, if that person is someone, if like this sort of foresight does not exist comparatively, I have no sort of incentive to actually go ahead and even interact with that person or quote with that person in the first place. Hence, all of the benefits that LO just gave you basically are something that Gov gives you in a better way, in an actual possible way, right? Understand that even then, Gov comes and gives you, sorry, Op comes and gives you like this huge harm, right? That is actually that people with exclusive interests are only going to interact and like racism, etc., is going to increase. We tell you that even if people with similar, and this is like a huge right, because we still prove to you that people with different social groups are more likely to interact. But even if you don't buy that argument, there is still going to be less racism. There is still going to be like, like all of these harms are not going to exist, at least because this only happens with relationships, right? This or sort of foresight of pleasure is only with relationships. I'm still going to have friends with people who do not exactly belong to whatever op means by like social circles or identities. People are still going to interact in other ways as friends, as colleagues, as co-workers, etc., etc. Is that relationships are something where people would tend to believe in a pleasure principle, and that pleasure principle is something which we still tell you is going to actually lead to breaking of social circles, not what op tells you. So at that point, nothing that LO gave you stands in this debate. Now understand what we give you, right? We tell you that in terms of a principle, we tell you that consent to relationships is something which is inherently important, and that consent is based on knowledge, right? But this knowledge of what the relationship is going to be like in today's world is basically based on what courting looks like, right? That's the whole concept of courting, that you basically in like true sense, the concept of courting is that basically two people hang out and see whether they are compatible or not. The issue with that is that during courting, those two people are just trying to impress each other, but at a point where the relationship begins, it's a lot more likely that those people are going to stop giving a shit about impressing each other. And at that point, personalities or truer traits might come up, and that same might not be compatible. Although earlier these people felt that they are a lot more compatible. What this leads to as an obvious harm is that now we're in like status quo. I feel that what the fuck happened? Like what went wrong in the with my relationship? At that point, either you blame someone else, in which case you feel when you're blaming someone else, if there was some sort of fault on your part, there is no growth. And in a scenario where you blame yourself, as said, you like start drinking, start like shooting up, etc., etc. Now we tell you that in a world where both of these harms exist on in the status quo, in our world, the benefit is that a person knows the sort of pleasure they are going to get, right? So in a scenario where they're actually getting into a relationship where they know that there will be some sort of net pleasure, this sort of net pleasure at least assumes the fact that there will be some level of compatibility, and at that point at least some sort of happiness. So when there is a net pleasure, the person is not likely to in the end, at the end of the relationship, start blaming the relationship and start feeling negative about the relationship. The person might still feel that some things which like there are some sort of traumas that are left, but when the net relationship, the net feeling about the relationship is positive, the person is more likely to introspect. Whereas on like off bench, the person is basically just hating on their ex and like getting drunk and sending them like stupid texts, right? Understand that there also exists like a placebo effect, right? And that's something we're going to talk about. If a person has a feeling that this relationship is going to be like net positive, even if the relationship ends, even if the person had some traumas that were faced during the relationship, the person knows that there is a number which told me that, I'm going to have like net positive experiences. So maybe I'm just looking at the net negative experiences so much more, and that's why I'm getting sad, right? At that point, the person is more likely to look at the pleasurable experiences, to look for those pleasurable experiences that a person had in the relationship. Whereas like in today's world, people are basically just looking at whatever went wrong, whatever the bad experiences they had, so that they can shift blame either, or second, or on the other hand, like blame themselves, both of which are things that we think are harmful. What's better is to actually understand mistakes and like objectively introspect, so that there can be growth, interpersonal growth, something that we think is only possible when you look at the relationship in a positive manner. Now understand another thing that we tell you, right? We tell you that there is a huge harm that exists in terms of like people, in terms of like people getting into relationships thinking that like the courting phase is going to exist till the end of the relationship, right? Understand the major harm that exists in terms of like principle. And this is going to be like somewhat something I was talking about earlier, is that romantic relationships have a higher propensity of like personas being animated during the courting phase, right? What it looks like is basically people acting in the way that they think that the other person is going to like. But we tell you that in a relationship where the people know that they are going to like get a net sort of net happiness, at that point those people are also more likely to be their truer selves during the courting period, right? Understand why this is more likely? Because where on op side, the person knows that they need to like impress the person, and that they need to like be someone that they are not, maybe in some scenarios, to impress the other person, or at least like act more happy, act more positive in a normal sense. While quoting, we tell you that on our side of the house, people know that they are going to have a net experiences. And since we've already like given you a lot of framing in terms of like the placebo effect, etc., they feel that even being their truer self will lead to a net happy experience. And hence in the like in the courting phase, though people are more likely to actually act in a positive, in a manner that like in the true personality, and not like co-opt some sort of fake personality or animated personality just to impress the other person. What it leads to, again, as a circular argument, is first of all true a consent to a relationship. Second of all, people know who they are getting into relationships with, which as we already mentioned is like important for consent, because knowledge is important and agency can only be exercised in knowledge. But also at the end of the relationship, at least you know that there was no point at which the other person was faking something, other person was faking their personality, or like you were duped into it or something like that. And at that point relationships are a lot more honest, and that's why we think that we take this debate with a nice margin. Very, very proud.
All right, thank you, DPM. Let's have the next speaker, Diallo. Here.
Am I audible?
Loud and clear. Go for it.
I see chat all the time, so I can take point of information when you write in chat. My speech starts 3, 2, 1. Thank you, Chairperson. I'd like to answer 3 questions in this debate. Firstly, about accountability and responsibility based on consent. Secondly, which paradigm we can create bigger incentive for people to interact with people from different backgrounds. Thirdly, my new substantive, discovery of new values, which is not pleasant all the time, which directly clashes with the final argumentation coming from Deputy Prime Minister. So that's about accountability. So the main case from opening government is when you know the pleasure beforehand, the relationship will be much more accountable. When something happened, you cannot shift responsibility to others. But this is dangerous. It's better when you can shift responsibility to others or external factors. When you blame yourself, when you think you are source of responsibility for breakup and divorce, you are more likely to be mentally depressed, and that is dangerous. Even if you faked personality, you animated your personality in favor of your partner, you failed. That's what mentality is. That is how mentality is going to be constructed. And even if you are the victim of, let's say, abortion or domestic violence, you think you are the failure and you failed. It's your responsibility. As a result of which some people might commit suicide, and that's a worse consequence. So let's make a trade-off. We understand some people can grow up and become stronger after that, that sort of self-blaming relationship, but some people may commit suicide and mentally depressed. We believe significance and the worst consequence of this tragedy is far higher than the possible best scenario explained by the opening government. Hence, the accountability argument does not stand. Moving on, which paradigm can create a bigger incentive for people to interact with people from different backgrounds? The deputy leader of opposition explained that, unless we know the pleasure beforehand, we stay in a comfortable zone and safe zone. We never try to interact with others from different backgrounds. I think the Deputy Prime Minister misunderstood the target. The Deputy Prime Minister was talking about very progressive, open-minded people. I think those people have already communicated and interacted with people from different backgrounds. What we have to focus on is more moderately conservative or sometimes open-minded, but sometimes not kind of people. But for those people, if they cannot see the consequence of a pleasure and relationship, they might interact with others in college, in school, workplace, community, when they belong in the same debate club, for example. They have many chances in which they go drinking together and interact with it together and deepen the relationship. Otherwise, there's no incentive for people in like a rich white guy to communicate with a Japanese guy like me if they see the consequences beforehand. Therefore, we believe bias, preconception is such a dangerous thing which exacerbates social divisions even more. Let's move on to my final argumentations about discovery of new values. Before that, I would like to take a point of information from closing government, if you have.
Hi. So the same bias and the disappointment, right, or racial division still exists on your side. So people only interact with each other on the same side, right? And that's a subjective judgment. Those things still exist.
Okay. By the way, it's long time no see, Jeff. It's my pleasure to debate against you and see you here again. What are you up to these days? By the way, okay. explained, yeah, explained that those people who have preconception already avoid, interaction. But we see it's much better when people cannot see the consequence of pleasure and as a result of relationship, right? When people cannot see the consequence, people have interest of exploring the, unknown values. This is actually the third argument, discovery of new values. This debate is, I understand, broadly about what enriches life of human being, right? Pleasure is not the only source of happiness for human being. Even if we are not talking about capitalistic pleasure, we believe discovery of new values enriches people's lives. So pleasure is not only a form of happiness in human being. Diverse conceptions, values, ideologies that you never encountered otherwise, right? That's what people can gain by interacting with other people from different backgrounds. That's not pleasant at all. Sometimes, you can grow as a human being, eventually get better happiness, but at the short term, maybe your identity is a bit shaken to the core. Discovery and understanding of something brand new comes with a hurt. You have to confront countervailing views, and your identity is seriously shaken up. For example, I'm a libertarian, but many of my friends in debate communities are communists, somewhat. And Facebook feed and Twitters are full of pro-communism posts. It's not pleasure at all for me, initially. Interacting with communism believers is not pleasure at all. If I know what pleasure would be beforehand, I would never talk to them. However, interaction with those communism in my debate friends teaches me that I'm not aware of the poor people's life in reality. I've grown up in relatively rich middle-class family. I've never paid attention to the real predicament and the hardship that these people go through. It was a brutal experience for me because I have to wake up and I have to be aware of my privilege, and I'm complicit in perpetuating this social division. But at least in a long time, I grew up as a human being. Remember your high school days and young age, you experienced the breakup with your boyfriend and girlfriend, right? Maybe divorce when you're an adult. It was not pleasant at all. It was very cruel experience. But now you are kind and more benevolent to other people because now you understand what other people feel and how other people feel about it. That's how human beings actually grow. Therefore, hardship and predicaments is great experience and very precious in a long term. Why this is important? Two ways. Firstly, personal relationship with one particular person is not permanent all the time. Maybe the person goes away or get relocated or moved to other nations, right? You need to construct new relationship from scratch in a longer term, in someday in your futures. Now you are proud of your ability to, accept diversity or differences, even though pleasure is not maximized, even though you have to go through predicament and hardships. Now you have ability to construct a relationship. It is better in a longer term because government side only pays attention to short-sighted pleasure in a relationship, just one relationship in front of your eyes. No, we got to consider the future relationship that you have to construct newly at some point. In that perspective, our paradigm is much better. Secondly, happiness comes with self-actualization and self-affirmation. When you love yourself, you can feel better happiness. The danger of the other side is you find pleasure and happiness from toxic relationship. You rely on someone to get pleasure. You depend on someone to maximize your pleasure. And that mindset and an attitude is very toxic, and that undermines the ability of an individual to live a life strongly. That is why we oppose the motion. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Diallo, for that speech. Let's have the next speaker, member of GUF. Here.
All right, I prefer to take POI through voice. Thank you. All right, nice to debate with you, Mizushi, but there are few things wrong with your case. So I think our case is primarily built on two premises. One is if you have more money, you necessarily derive more pleasure from it. And two, that some information is worse somehow than full information or no information at all, right? Because according to open opposition, partial information is what clouds your judgment and makes you make more biased decision than otherwise if there's no information at all. The reason why these two premises are false as follows. The first, money equals more pleasure. Is there a certain thing as high pleasure and low pressure, which open government were trying to explain, but they were unable to substantiate. So reason why we think this is an important clarification is there are certain high and low pressure. So if you walk through a very long, arduous journey, and then you eventually arrive at self-change, right? You have this epiphany. That pleasure point is necessarily going to be higher compared to if you are drinking and having drugs and partying for a night, right? So this difference between high and low pleasure is going to be reflected in the overall scale. So if you see someone say they have 1,000 points, but it's very difficult to work with this person, then it necessarily means that the pleasure is going to come after you have worked through those different difficulties. And if you see someone else, on the other hand, who has a low pleasure point of 100, and it's very easy to go with this person. You're drinking, having a good time, eating barbecue every single day. That means that all your experience is a low level pleasure, and those pleasures aren't as important on the overall scale. So this defeats the entire premise of our open opposition, because they simply suggest that displeasure is something that necessarily will discourage people. And that something is going to show overwhelming negative review when you look up Tinder and be like, oh, this person has really low point, right? But we think that that isn't necessarily going to happen, because the way that this scale is going to work is that you're not sure where those pleasures going to come from, and you have to still take a chance. And we think individuals are not ignorant enough to believe that as long as they pick someone who have high pleasure, there is no difficulty at all to work through. There's no point at all to even try to work out the differences. Now, there's one strenuous rebuttal I want to go through, and then I have 2 points of extension. That this one rebuttal is, so oppositions I say, you need to blame other people in order to get through those breakups, because blaming yourself is terrible. There are two reasons why blaming others is just definitely unhealthy. One is because you become grumpy person. You are unable to look into yourself and seek improvement. When you go to next relationship, you just cannot use that person as a leverage to find outlet to make the other person feel also terrible about them, so that you can feel good about yourself, right? Because you're never fixing the fundamental flaw, it's unclear why you can ever have happiness on their side. Second, is that changing other people is just inherently difficult, right? It's easier to change yourself than it is to change other people. So if you blame yourself, even though you're gonna feel shit about it in a short time, you can still seek help. Your friends and family are there, and they are something that you can work on. And then next time you can compare how you do in your previous self and then feel better about it in the future. So there's actually still more improvement on our side anyway. So first point of extension is I want to talk about how we maximize personal growth. Right. Now we're going to differentiate from OO because we're going to have more concrete solutions, and then we have more impact analysis. But before that, I'll take a POI.
I'm a little confused because when I'm choosing a relationship, usually I know I want someone supportive or I know I want someone fun. But the problem is you equivocate and homogenize all pleasures. So I think I'm choosing the person I need, but they maybe can't provide me with the tools I need from a relationship. Now, resolve the model.
I'm not very clear where it's confusing, because if you believe that being supportive is something that you value, you can still choose that. But if you think that being supportive in the short term is not as important, and a big pleasure point that you're gonna get in the future by working through those difficulties, then you're still free to choose so. So yeah, maybe you can just figure that out later, right? So extension number one, how we maximize personal growth. So 3 points of analysis. One is we encourage people to walk through those hardships, to know that if someone is worth your time. We need to understand one thing: not all hardships are equal, right? Not everyone is worth your time. Sometimes a relationship is difficult because that person is just terrible, and the opposition side make it sound like every difficulty must have its reasons. No, sometimes it doesn't. And we allow people to choose what kind of difficulty they work on, to know that if someone is worth the kind of efforts that you can spend. Second analysis, second point, right? That we encourage people to stay in for long-term stability. Like when they're not looking for just immediate adrenaline boost or one night stand, they actually are going to stay after the flame of passion has already went out, and they're still going to stay with each other after the immediate pressure is already gone. So this is going to be reflected in a high-low pressure model that OG already explained. Three is that we think the extent to which that we avoid harms is very important to the personal dilemma. For example, we think a lot of women faces domestic abuse or teenage pregnancy, and there's all of these scamming business that predicated on exploiting people's relationship is particularly harmful to marginalized women, and allowing them to avoid the harms that creates their inability to climb up the social ladder in the first place is something that is exclusively going to happen on the outside. So moving on to the second extension, how we encourage people to move beyond the materialistic metrics. We think there's a lot of pressure, like open opposition said, now people to choose doctors and lawyers and CEOs, or that people to choose only white people to date. All those pressures exist on the opposition side. But if there's some sudden a point measure that tells you that you cannot get more pleasure by going out with a black guy, you're gonna get more pleasure by marrying an entrepreneur from low-end business, you're more likely to be able to persuade your families to let you go out with that black guy. As unlike opposition side, they are still going to be subject to all this social pressure, family values, all the materialistic metrics of what defines a successful person is going to cloud the judgment of that person on the other side. Whereas on our side, it is easier, way more easier for people to discard their traditional notion of what makes them happy. Because maybe you think you're marrying a doctor for the money, but you did not know the doctor is gonna cheat in the future. And those pleasure points can be reflected in the overall trauma that you're gonna get, which will be reflected into a larger margin of sadness rather than happiness. So for these reasons, we are actually okay with rating people on Tinder. So okay, cool.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So generally responding to the closing opposition side, what has the closing opposition side generally brought you? The closing opposition side generally repeated the opening opposition's idea that you need to develop yourself within a relationship, but that completely disregards what the member of the government speaker has already told you, the idea of higher and lower pleasures, and that completely disregards why why some information is better than no information. They tell you that as long as it's not completely unknown, and as long as there's some information that suggests that there might not be the best bet, then people turn away from it. Now, what have we shown you so far? We already told you it is better to, even in the worst case scenario, to at least have this information. For example, on Google ratings of restaurants, 4.5 bears 2.8 stars in this case. You're not legally obliged to go to the 4.5 star restaurant. You can go give the 2.5 star restaurant a try as well, and if you might like it, it might be to your suiting, it might be subjective, you might enjoy it more in that case. So you can also go to the 4.5 star restaurant, and it might not be for you in this case, and that's the same case as love. So generally to respond to the entire closing opposition case so far, there's generally two things. One, if you really do not care about pleasure so much, if you really think that this whole metric doesn't matter, then there's no legal obligation that's going to force you to follow it. It's just we just believe that this is better to allow people to make a greater informed decision. And secondly, they completely disregard the idea of the higher and lower pleasure. And I believe with that, the entire closing opposition case does not stand. Now, generally, returning to what the closing government has brought to you. The closing government has brought to you the idea of efficiency and why that is necessarily better for society as a whole. So what does that necessarily mean in this case? As I already told you, this results in better relationships. The opening government has discussed that, but did not really give the appropriate analysis or mechanism to it. So what's the big difference in this case? We told you that what will happen on our side is the relationships will be less toxic and safer. And why uniquely is that? As we've proven to you, the concept of higher and lower pledges. So what's the big difference here? If a relationship, for example, as I told you, if a girl has two people that she could like in this case, one would be a rich doctor and one would be a young entrepreneur in this case. Conventional wisdom will tell her to go after the doctor, and that's the harm that the entire opposition side believes in this case. The opposition side claims that we will cause her to go after the doctor, but we already told you this isn't about sudden pleasures where the doctor like gives you a watch and you're internally happy in this case. What we're simply saying is this metric takes into personal growth as well. So let's get rid of the complete benefit of the entire opposition bench in which we talk about self-growth. So what's the difference here? If the doctor really does cheat on you, if the doctor is maybe unfaithful, then in this case, what will happen? Then in this case, his pleasure score will be way lower because there's less growth, there's less personal growth. He's just occasionally there and gives you a watch, maybe 100 units of pleasure every 2 years or so. That's way worse than 10 pleasure units every day, as what the young entrepreneur can say. So what the young woman could do now is she can take a look at an entrepreneur, and if she does feel passionate about sort of spending her life with him, in this case, she'll know that this entrepreneur is definitely kind-hearted and definitely actually cares about her, and this will be able to break the traditional conventional wisdom and barrier of the original families that's trying to convince her to marry the doctor, because she can say, look, this guy is going to be more faithful and this is why I want to stay with him. Before I move on to my next impact, POI.
Yes, it cuts both ways. When you love someone with a different ethnic group, but your family can prove that the relation does not maximize the pleasure and pressure you to break up. So it cuts both ways. It doesn't benefit you at all. Someone can abuse the system.
But as you said, if it's just up to family pressure, that's not uniquely a harm on the government side. That can happen on the opposition side. If the family really could pressure that much, then that should be just left. That exists on both sides. What is uniquely going to happen, what the unique harm of the opposition bench is that this is going to cause that problem. And we already told you this doesn't cause it, because this will only help them in this case. This will only help them make a better decision in this case. And the harm only exists if the entrepreneur is unfaithful. But if the entrepreneur is unfaithful and doesn't help self-growth, then that doesn't really matter in this case. So moving on to our next benefit, what we tell you is that this lessens harms towards the young lovers in this case who could be falling into certain harm to themselves. For example, teenage pregnancies or domestic violence. Well, notice that this is slightly different to the idea of clarity. This also talks about how this metric will also reduce the chance of teenage pregnancies or other such harms being incurred by lovers in this case, because these lovers, before they enter a relationship, they'll have better information as to what's going to happen. They'll have better information as whether this relationship is worth it, whether this growth is going to be worth it. And if the opposition side really does think that this teenage pregnancy is worth it and that this is really worth growing, we do not believe that. Let's weigh that impact in this case. Is really teenage pregnancies is really throwing the lives of these young women, is really destroying their entire livelihoods and causing them to be in peril, really worth some amount of self-growth? As we already told you, this metric will allow them to have better decision making. And even if they really do feel that going for this most risky choice is a good idea, then that at least they make this out of their free will. At least they make this out of an informed decision. And that's a unique benefit that the closing government brings. The idea that there's an informed choice and that people will not go into the relationships where they will necessarily get harmed without knowing. So now onto the idea of comparisons in this case. So what is necessarily on the closing government specialized world? We tell you that in this case, there will definitely be ratings in this case, and there will definitely be more understanding as to who one wants to fall in love with. So what does this look like? Obviously, they will look at who's they'll look at the loves in this case, they'll look at the benefits, they'll look at the growth for all of us. So what does this, let's draw a parallel to the modern world. So what this looks like is if a debate coach forces you to work with another partner that you may not be in a very good standing with in this case. Well, you both might not like each other, but by not liking each other and by not working together, there's so much productivity and so much growth lost in this case. And this works in relationships as well. If the partner is really that great, but at the very start, you do not know each other as well, and maybe you are not as your interests are not as soon. This metric encourages you to continue working on it And slowly, once you come to a consensus, there will be such a great metric of growth that it is definitely uniquely a benefit to the closing government side, because this metric tells you the light. It's like the light at the end of a tunnel. This is what point shows you that there's definitely something that you can go on. And we told you that this benefit is uniquely better than the possible harm that they said of people not trying, which already told you doesn't really stand in this case. So what the entire opposition benches was is the idea in excessive conservatism, and in which family members can go by traditional means and say, oh, you know, this relationship isn't going to work because I just told you it's not going to work. This here is just a score that can give reference to the lovers and that can show their family that this relationship might work, and at least it opens the door to greater diversity and greater opportunity and growth as a whole. For that reason, we are very proud